I can't hear you.
ഏവർക്കും നമസ്കാരം. ക്വീരിതം ലെസ്ബിയൻ വിസിബിലിറ്റി വീക്കിന്റെ 6ാമത്തെ ദിവസത്തേക്ക് നമ്മൾ കടക്കുകയാണ്. ഇന്ന് നമ്മളോടൊപ്പം സംവദിക്കാനായിട്ട് നമുക്കൊപ്പം അതിഥിയായിട്ട് എത്തിയിട്ടുള്ളത് ദീപ വാസുദേവ് ആണ്. സഹയാത്രിക എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ലെസ്ബിയൻ, ബൈസെക്ഷൽ, ട്രാൻസ്ജെൻഡർ മനുഷ്യരുടെ എല്ലാം അവകാശങ്ങൾക്ക് വേണ്ടി പ്രവർത്തിക്കുന്ന സംഘടനയാണ് സഹയാത്രിക. സഹയാത്രികയെ പറ്റി പറയുകയാണെങ്കിൽ കേരളത്തിന്റെ ക്വീർ ചരിത്രത്തിൽ അത്രയേറെ പ്രാധാന്യം അർഹിക്കുന്ന ഒരു സംഘടനയാണ്. 2009 ഡൽഹി ഹൈക്കോടതിയുടെ നാസ് ജഡ്ജ്മെന്റ് വരുന്നതിന് മുമ്പേ 2008 ഔദ്യോഗികമായി നിലവിൽ വരപ്പെട്ട സംഘടനയാണ് സഹയാത്രിക. പക്ഷെ 2001 കാലഘട്ടം തൊട്ട് തന്നെ സഹയാത്രികയുടെ പ്രവർത്തനങ്ങൾ ആരംഭിച്ചിരുന്നു എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. നമുക്കൊന്നും ഒരു ക്വീർ രാഷ്ട്രീയത്തെ പറ്റി അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ക്വീർ മനുഷ്യരുടെ ദൃശ്യതയെ പറ്റിയൊന്നും ചിന്തിക്കാൻ പറ്റാത്ത ആ ഒരു കാലഘട്ടത്തിൽ ലെസ്ബിയൻ സ്ത്രീകളുടെ ദൃശ്യതയും അതേപോലെ തന്നെ ലെസ്ബിയൻ സ്ത്രീകളുടെ ക്രൈസിസ്, സൂയിസൈഡ്, ഇത്തരത്തിലുള്ള വളരെ ക്രൂഷ്യലായിട്ടുള്ള പ്രശ്നങ്ങളിലെല്ലാം ഇടപെട്ടിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു സംഘടനയാണ് സഹയാത്രിക. ആ സംഘടനയുടെ ഫൗണ്ടറായിട്ടുള്ള വ്യക്തി തന്നെയാണ് നമ്മളോടൊപ്പം ഇന്നുള്ളത്. നമ്മൾ ഇന്ന് സംസാരിക്കുന്ന വിഷയവും അത്രയേറെ പ്രാധാന്യം അർഹിക്കുന്ന ഒരു വിഷയം തന്നെയാണ്. കേരളത്തിൽ തുടർന്നുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്ന ലെസ്ബിയൻ ക്വീർ സ്ത്രീകളുടെ ആത്മഹത്യ, അവരനുഭവിക്കുന്ന ക്രൈസിസുകൾ. അപ്പോൾ അതിനെല്ലാം വളരെ കൃത്യമായി അഡ്രസ് ചെയ്യുകയും അതിലെല്ലാം ഇടപെടുകയും സൂയിസൈഡുകളുടെയൊക്കെ പാത്ത് ഫൈൻഡിങ് അടക്കം ചെയ്യുകയും ചെയ്തിട്ടുള്ള, അതിനെല്ലാം ഡോക്യുമെന്റ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു സംഘടന, അതിൻ്റെ ഫൗണ്ടർ എന്നുള്ള എല്ലാ രീതിയിലും, അതോടൊപ്പം കേരളത്തിലെ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഇന്ത്യയിലെ തന്നെ ക്വീർ മനുഷ്യരുടെ അവകാശങ്ങൾക്ക് വേണ്ടി പ്രവർത്തിക്കുന്ന ഒരു വ്യക്തി എന്ന രീതിയിലും ദീപ വാസുദേവിനെ ഈ ഒരു ഇന്നത്തെ ഈ ഡിസ്കഷനിലേക്ക്, ഇന്നത്തെ ഈ ഒരു സംസാരത്തിലേക്ക്, അവതരണത്തിലേക്ക് ഞാൻ ഏറ്റവും സ്നേഹത്തോടെ ക്ഷണിക്കുകയാണ്. ദിവേച്ചി മൈക്ക് അൺമ്യൂട്ട് ചെയ്യാവോ?
Hi Deepa, can you unmute your mic?
Yes. Now can you hear me?
Yes, it's audible.
Okay, and I'm having trouble hearing you. Let's see. Can people people can hear me now? Yana English also it's I can speak more complexly, and also sometimes people can't understand my Malayalam. So I'm hoping someone will also translate.
Yes, we have.
And
Abhi is here. Abhijit is here. He's one of our members. He will translate.
Awesome. And forgive me for looking a little funny and holding my speaker to my ear. I'm having some technical difficulty here. Okay, so this is an interactive session, I think, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm really I should be honest with you that sometimes I have this kind of reaction. I think that Lesbian Visibility Day should be organized by lesbians, and Queer Pride should be organized by queer people and things like that, which of course that type of agency politics is important, but at the same time I feel really touched that Queerythm, that to have other people also making like lesbians and queer women kind of at center, and not in an objectifying or titillating way, but in terms of understanding these identities. And so I'm really grateful to Queerythm. I've been the sessions I've been to have been so informative and interesting and exciting. So I loved the scholarship thing. I loved listening to Daya Gayatri and Sitara, Reshma, of course. We go way back. And so thank you for having me here. Should I start, or do you want to translate that?
Abhi.
നമസ്കാരം. What she is trying to say is that നമ്മളോട് പറയുന്നത് ഒരുപാട് സന്തോഷം, നമുക്കിതൊരു ഇന്ററാക്റ്റീവ് സെഷൻ പോലെയാണ് നമുക്ക് കൊണ്ടാടപ്പെടുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ ലെസ്ബിയൻ വിസിബിലിറ്റി വീക്കിനെ പറ്റിക്കുന്നുള്ള ആശംസ പോലെ പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ട്. നമുക്ക് ഇനിയും നമ്മുടെ സെഷനിലേക്ക് കടക്കാമെന്നാണ് പുള്ളിക്കാരി പറയുന്നത്.
Okay, I'm hoping, I want to also say, because my subject is crisis intervention. I've been involved in doing this for 20 years. In the recent years, I'm really more of an advisor. Our team is more involved in crisis intervention. Amana, Shruti, Praveen, Sunil. And so, I think I'm going to leave some open spaces for them to also talk about a crisis cases. I want to kind of give a history, like not too long, because Reshma also talked about some of those things, and flag some sort of issues around like specific, female-born identities, crisis situation, and specifically lesbians/queer women, and also maybe talk a little bit about lesbian identity, and I like to have questions, because there's just I was preparing for this. Prijit told me to make a report, and I don't have any sort of formal report that's up to date. I have some funding reports. I have things we wrote a long time ago. So I'm just trying to amalgamate this huge amount of information. So I'm very happy for people to interrupt and ask questions and give some direction also.
ഓക്കെ, ദീപ ചേച്ചിയുടെ പ്രവർത്തന മേഖല എന്ന് പറയുമ്പോൾ ക്രൈസിസ് ഇന്റർവെൻഷൻ ആണ്. അപ്പോൾ അതിന്റെ കൂടെ തന്നെ ഒരുപാട് കാര്യങ്ങൾ ഇന്നലെ തന്നെ ലെസ്ബിയൻ ഫെമിനിസത്തെ കുറിച്ചും, അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ലെസ്ബിയൻസിന് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ വുമൻ ഐഡന്റിഫൈഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരുപാട് ക്വയർ ആളുകൾ അനുഭവിക്കുന്ന പ്രശ്നങ്ങളെ പറ്റിയും ഒക്കെ ഇന്നലെ രേഷ്മ ഭരദ്വാജ് അടക്കം ഒരുപാട് ആളുകൾ ഇവിടെ സംസാരിച്ചിട്ട് ഉണ്ടാകുമെന്ന് കരുതുന്നു. അപ്പോൾ പുള്ളിക്കാരി മോർ ഓഫ് ആൻ ഇന്ററാക്റ്റീവ് സെഷൻ പോലെയാണ് പുള്ളിക്കാരി ഈ ഒരു സെഷനെ കൊണ്ടുപോകാൻ ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നത് എന്നാണ് ദീപ ചേച്ചി പറയുന്നത്.
I think I'll just start with, so we basically did our first lesbian suicide. I'll have to call them lesbian/trans suicides because some of the suicides were gender non-conforming people. They were all female born people, but we don't know their identities. They passed away. Our first lesbian suicide fact finding was in February 2002. And our most recent lesbian suicide fact finding was this year in March or April. So, we've kind of had a long history with it. And suicide itself has been a huge, as any community person knows, or, it's been a huge issue for, so many of our identities. I won't too much into it because Reshma also spoke about it, but basically these newspaper stories were appearing. A lot were coming from a newspaper called Samiksha. Casey Sebastian was a journalist, and he was naming a lot of suicides. He was saying as lesbian suicides, and then a couple of them appeared in Mathrubhumi or more mainstream newspapers. And there was a community person in Thrissur who was on the LGBT India lists. There was no Facebook or even Orkut or anything then, but there were LGBT lists, and he was sharing all of these, and people were talking about it in the movement, but there wasn't any sort of very formalized queer movement in Kerala at that time. There was HIV prevention projects that were doing stuff with so-called MSMs, who might today be like queer trans men. There were male sex workers, which were part of sex workers movement, but there wasn't outside of that. There was not much mobilization, right? People in other parts of the country didn't have like much contact within Kerala, and so I came to Kerala as this kind of root-seeking Malayali who was born in Canada, and I was also queer, and I just I ended up getting into this, and so we made a list of the fact findings. I'm just going to very quickly just kind of just go through that original list. I'm not going to go into lots of detail, but I just want to give you an idea of the sort of class, caste, location of people, and this kind of thing that was appearing on our original list in 2002, and most of these happened like within 2 or 3 years. Let me just find it. So so some of the newspaper stories were I think two women who were working on a coffee plantation, 2 Adivasi girls, 2 newspapers described as lower middle class students, a Dalit student who committed suicide, and it kind of became a political issue in Kerala Varma College, a tailoring and beautician course student, 2 girls who worked in a shrimp factory, another tailoring student, and tailoring teacher and her student, 3, a lot of people in like villages, a lot of people from marginalized communities. It's not to say that people from more privileged communities were not also struggling, were not also committing suicide, but these were the stories that were coming in the newspaper. And so one of the things that Sahiyatrika did, that we tried to do from, these people that we were aligned with, was to do fact findings into them. And, actually the first project that I wrote as a kind of like a project, it was actually about lesbian and bisexual women. And then what happened, like with lots of lesbian groups across India, is that many of our members are also trans. Many of them people went, and so even within our fact finding, if you look at the fact finding, some of the people were gender non-conforming, and those languages were not available in the way that we are now, so we can't really retrospectively say. But all of the people were young people. They were all female, gender assigned at birth. Many of them looked very much like lesbian relationships, and in many of the cases, community people acknowledged that there was some sort of relationship. some of this you can see in the book Reshma edited with Book Forum. Some details about these fact findings are there, and then we've given it to other researchers, the scholars, these transcripts that we made. What I wanted to say for this, just to start with, is that so it was from my personal point of view, I came out as a queer person in Canada, as a queer person of color, and I thought that the women's movement here would support that, and it was kind of a struggle, but we found support among sex workers movements and other supporters, other feminist supporters, and people had many sort of doubts about. A lot of doubts like who, there are no lesbians, there are no gays, there are no trans people in Kerala. That came up, that lesbianism is a kind of privileged, wealthy thing from the West, and people saw me, and that very much justified that kind of prejudice. That these suicides were not about sexuality; they were about people living in poverty or being victims of sex rackets, and and so it's a very doing a fact finding into a suicide is a very complicated thing, and there it was more complicated because that public discourse around being queer or trans wasn't there. So we tried to be really sensitive about it. We kind of published the transcripts without making too much interpretation, and things, and we tried to maintain people's anonymity so that people wouldn't be traumatized in their localities and things. But definitely, many of the relationships, they were same-sex relationships, and it does seem like pressures, like marriage pressures, family pressures, community pressures, contributed to people's deaths. And maybe Reshma or someone else might want to talk about that. But those were the first fact findings we did. We also had a helpline, So I'll let you translate that.
ഓക്കെ, ദീപ ചേച്ചി പറയുന്നത് നമ്മുടെ ഈ ഒരു ന്യൂസ് പേപ്പേഴ്സിലൊക്കെ വന്നത് ഏരിയയിൽ പറയാൻ ശ്രമിച്ചത്. എക്സാമ്പിൾ, ഒരു ലെസ്ബിയൻ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു വുമൻ എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിലുള്ള ഒരു സൂയിസൈഡിനെ പറ്റിയല്ല പഠനം നടത്തിയത്. ഫോർ എക്സാമ്പിൾ, ലെസ്ബിയൻ ട്രാൻസ് സൂയിസൈഡ് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ജെൻഡർ നോൺ കൺഫേമിംഗ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു സൂയിസൈഡിനെ പറ്റിയാണ്. 2002 ഒക്കെ ഒരുപാട് ന്യൂസുകൾ നമ്മൾ കേൾക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. അതായത് 2 വുമൺ വർക്കിംഗ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ആദിവാസി ഗേൾസ് സൂയിസൈഡ് ചെയ്തു. കേരള വർമ്മ കോളേജിലെ 2 പെൺകുട്ടികൾ സൂയിസൈഡ് ചെയ്തു. നമ്മുടെ കൊഞ്ച് ഫാക്ടറി, അതായത് ഷ്രിംപ് ഫാക്ടറി, അതായത് കൊഞ്ച് ഫാക്ടറിയിലെ 2 ആളുകൾ സൂയിസൈഡ് ചെയ്തു. ടൈലറിംഗ് ടീച്ചർ ആൻഡ് ഹെഡ് സ്റ്റുഡൻ്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള 2 പെൺകുട്ടികൾ സൂയിസൈഡ് ചെയ്തു. അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരുപാട് വില്ലേജ് ആൻഡ് റൂറൽ ഏരിയ, അതായത് ഗ്രാമപ്രദേശങ്ങളിലുള്ള ഒരുപാട് വുമൻ ഫ്രണ്ട്സ് ആയിട്ടുള്ളവർ സൂയിസൈഡ് ചെയ്യപ്പെടുന്നു എന്നുള്ള കാര്യമൊക്കെ ന്യൂസ് റിപ്പോർട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ കൂടി തന്നെ അതിനെ ഒരു ഫ്രണ്ട്സ് എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിലാണ് പലപ്പോഴായിട്ട് ഇവര് ന്യൂസിലും അതുപോലെ തന്നെയുള്ള ആ ഒരു മീഡിയത്തിൽ കൂടെയൊക്കെ പുറത്ത് കൊണ്ടുവരുന്നത്. അതായത് ഒരിക്കലും അവരുടെ ഒരു സെക്ഷൽ ഐഡന്റിറ്റി അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അവരുടെ ജെൻഡർ എന്താണെന്നുള്ള കാര്യത്തിനെ പറ്റിയോ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അവരുടെ സെക്ഷൽ ഐഡന്റിറ്റി ഇതുകൊണ്ടാണ് അവർ സൂയിസൈഡ് ചെയ്യപ്പെടുന്നതോ എന്നുള്ള കാര്യങ്ങളായിട്ട് നമ്മൾ അഡ്രസ്സ് ചെയ്യപ്പെടുന്നുണ്ട്. അപ്പം കനേഡിയയിൽ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ കാനഡയിലോ വുമൺ ഓഫ് കളേഴ്സും ഫെമിനിസ്റ്റ് സപ്പോർട്ടേഴ്സുമായിട്ടുള്ള ഒരുപാട് ആളുകളോട് സംസാരിച്ചതിന്റെ അടിസ്ഥാനത്തിൽ നമ്മുടെ കേരളത്തിൽ തന്നെ ഒരു കറക്റ്റായിട്ട് ഇങ്ങനെ ഒരു കാര്യം അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു സൂയിസൈഡ് റേറ്റോ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ മരണകാരണം എന്താണോ ഐഡന്റിഫൈ ചെയ്യപ്പെടുന്നില്ല എന്നുള്ള കാര്യം പറഞ്ഞു വരുന്നുണ്ട്. അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ദീപ ചേച്ചിയുടെ ആദ്യത്തെ ഫസ്റ്റ് പ്രോജക്റ്റ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് പാത്ത് ഫൈൻഡിങ്സ് ആണ്. ലെസ്ബിയൻ ബൈസെക്ഷൽ വുമൻസിന്റെ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ജെൻഡർ നോൺ കൺഫോമിംഗ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള വുമൻസിന്റെ ഇടയിലുള്ള ഒരു പാത്ത് ഫൈൻഡിങ് ആയിട്ട് ഒരുപാട് കാര്യങ്ങൾ കണ്ടെത്തിയിട്ടുണ്ട്. അപ്പൊ അതിന്റെ അടിസ്ഥാനത്തിൽ ഇങ്ങനൊരു സപ്പോർട്ട് സിസ്റ്റം ഉള്ളത് കൊണ്ട് തന്നെ നമ്മുടെ കേരളത്തിൽ ഇന്ന് നടന്നു വരുന്ന ഒരുപാട് സൂയിസൈഡ് റേറ്റ്സിനെ പറ്റിയും അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അതിന് ചുക്കാൻ പിടിച്ചുള്ള വാർത്തകളിലൊക്കെയും അതിനെ ഒരു പക്ഷേ ഒരു ഹോമോഫോബിയ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു പറയുന്ന ട്രാൻസ്ഫോബിയ ഉള്ളത് കൊണ്ടായിരിക്കാം അതിനെയൊക്കെ മറ്റൊരു രീതിയിലാണ് ചിത്രീകരിക്കപ്പെടുന്നത് എന്നുള്ള ഒരു പാത്ത് ഫൈൻഡിങ്സ് ആണ് പുള്ളിക്കാരിയുടെ ഫസ്റ്റ് പ്രോജക്റ്റിലൂടെ പുള്ളിക്കാരി പറഞ്ഞു വെക്കുന്നത്. Ma'am, you can continue.
Okay, I think there's just maybe 2 or 3 points I'll make about our kind of beginning communities and how. Okay, so when I'm So, I mean, I think that because we started with this suicide and because of the politics of the people involved, and because many of the first people that we did crisis intervention with had stories that were very similar to the stories that happened in the suicide fact findings, and many people were not everyone was from an urban background, not a lot of people were from working class backgrounds. So like I think that from like our community has always had a sort of intersectional kind of approach to our marginalizations, because even from these suicides and even from like the first kind of people who were coming forward or who were asking for support, people had kind of multiple marginalizations. So they might have been lesbian, they might have been trans men, and but also working class, maybe Dalit, maybe and so that is like though it's not like Sahayatika has we don't all agree about our politics and stuff, but I think that was an aspect of our community from the beginning with like its advantages and disadvantages. Secondly, so like like we have lots of different there's lots of different alliances within queer trans movements. Sometimes trans men and trans women are in alliance, sometimes gays and lesbians are in alliance, and so our sort of primary thing has been people who are gender assigned female at birth, and so that is involving lesbians, bisexual women, trans men, gender non-conforming people, intersex people, and it's not that I thought like the Daya has also been involved with Sahay Africa, and I loved it was such a great discussion that she and her partner had, and I should say also that in our early years there were trans women, bisexual trans women like Tamala or Kajol who were very supportive of us, and those were trans women who were within traditional Hijra communities. Their guru was Revati, and she was like the progressive guru, and they were trying to create space for being Hijra, being a bisexual Hijra or queer Hijra within Hammam. So just as a point, so there's so many different locations in which we can express our identities, but so we kind of have this very complicated way of describing our identity as a group. It's sort of like primarily female assigned people, and then if there's other people who identify with us, we have that kind of openness and fluidity. So just as a thing, maybe you could just translate those things. Yeah. Is it too weird? Hello?
Ma'am, I haven't got your second point, what you're saying, because there's network issues happening here. So can you repeat the second point
Okay.
about different alliances and trans alliances, lesbian alliances happening? That second point.
So I was trying to say that our kind of primary identities, like around like our core area of crisis intervention is around people who are gender assigned female at birth. So when I say that, I mean that people who are born into their families as daughters, that would be, and as people, people go on to have multiple identities. Some people are lesbian or queer or they're trans men. Right now, I think that our organization is more than 50% trans men. And I'm going to talk about that also, since we're talking about lesbian visibility and lesbian specific issues. But so that's kind of our base community, and that's a community that's particularly affected by patriarchy. We're all affected by patriarchy, but in kind of very specific ways. And the way that you see that is because of the similarity in the crisis people have. I think that, like, I'm not interested in comparing. I'm not interested. I think that, like trans women experience some very specific types of like public violence that we don't see very much in our community. I think each identity gave, and I'm not, I think there are many different specificities with different identities, but what we're finding is that in terms of crisis, in terms of the type of violence that within families, there's, you know, the type lesbians, trans men, female born people, they have a set of experiences that are very often common, you know, and so that we see again and again in crisis intervention. And so that's why we have this that's kind of our description of this particular community. Does that make sense? Do you want me to try it in Malayalam? Or
No, ma'am, it's understood. I can explain
okay,
it. It's
okay.
okay, no problem. ദീപ മാമിന്റെ ഫാക്ട് ഫൈൻഡിങ്സ് ഒരുപാട് സൂയിസൈഡൽ റേറ്റ്സ് കൂടി വരുന്നതായിട്ട് കാണുന്നുണ്ട്. അതായത് നമ്മുടെ സൊസൈറ്റിയിലുള്ള അപ്രോച്ചസ് ആണ്. കാരണം ഒന്നാമത്തെ കാര്യം, നമ്മളെല്ലാം ഈ ഒരു ആണധികാര വ്യവസ്ഥയിൽ പാട്രിയാർക്കൽ സൊസൈറ്റിയിൽ ജീവിക്കുന്നത് കൊണ്ട് തന്നെ നമ്മുടെ എല്ലാം ഒരു മെയിൻ ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഈ ഒരു പാട്രിയാർക്കല് നമ്മുടെ രണ്ടാം തരക്കാരായിട്ട് കരുതപ്പെടുന്ന വുമൻസിന്റെ ഇടയിലുള്ള ഈ വുമൻസിനോടും അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ട്രാൻസ് വുമൻസിനോടും ലെസ്ബിയൻസിനോടും ട്രാൻസ്മെൻ വ്യക്തികളോടുമുള്ള സൊസൈറ്റിയുടെ അപ്രോച്ചും ഫാമിലിയുടെ അപ്രോച്ചും ഒക്കെ ഭയങ്കര ദുഷ്കരമായിട്ടുള്ള കാര്യമാണ്. കാരണം ക്രൈസിസ് മാനേജ്മെന്റുമായിട്ട് നമ്മൾ ഇവരെ സമീപിക്കുമ്പോഴും അത്തരം ഒരു വളരെ മോശമായിട്ടുള്ള അപ്രോച്ചസ് ആണ് പല ഭാഗത്തുനിന്ന് കിട്ടിക്കൊണ്ടിരിക്കുന്നത്. അതായത് ജെൻഡർ അസൈൻഡ് ആയിട്ട് ഫീമെയിൽ ആയിട്ട് വന്ന സിസ്ജെൻഡർ ഫീമെയിൽസിനും അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ട്രാൻസ് വുമൻസിനും അതുപോലെ തന്നെ ലെസ്ബിയൻ ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഐഡന്റിഫൈ ചെയ്യുന്ന വുമൻസിനും എല്ലാം ഈ പറയുന്നത് പോലെയുള്ള ക്രൈസിസും അവർക്കുണ്ടാവുന്ന ഫാക്ടേഴ്സും അവർക്കുണ്ടാവുന്ന പല എല്ലാം ഒന്നാണെന്ന് ഈ ഒരു പാത്ത് ഫൈൻഡിങ്സിലൂടെ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ആ ഒരു സ്റ്റഡി റിസൾട്ട്.
Okay, so ഞാൻ ഇപ്പോഴും actually fact findings, sorry, did I interrupt you? ഞാൻ ഇപ്പോഴും ഈ fact findings മാത്രം കുറിച്ച് സംസാരിച്ചിരിക്കുകയാണ്. I'm talking about a crisis intervention practice, and it's not queer women and trans women, it's queer women and trans men that I'm saying have very similar kind of patterns in terms of like the crisis in families. And I also kind of was trying to acknowledge the contribution of queer trans women to our organization, like even in the early years, and just family casual. But I think our primary focus has been on people who are gender side female at birth, whether they're lesbians or trans men or bisexual women, because there are in the crisis intervention, because they're perceived as daughters in their family, regardless of how they end up identifying. So does that clarification make sense? I'm just trying to describe the
എന്തെങ്കിലുമൊക്കെ ആർക്കെങ്കിലും ഓഡിയൻസിന് ചോദിക്കാൻ പറ്റുമെന്നുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ചേച്ചിയോട് ചോദിക്കാമെന്നാണ് പുള്ളിക്കാരി പറയുന്നത്. സോ എന്തെങ്കിലും ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസ് ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഇപ്പൊ ചോദിക്കാവുന്നതാണ്.
I'm sorry about that. Is what I'm saying clear, or is it? I'll just try and I'm just trying to explain, you know, that kind of politics we have, because you know, actually, if you look at crisis intervention now, like you look at the type of crisis, like, you know, really that's the line that we're organizing around. It's like LBT. It's like about certain things that happen to female-born people as a particular type of crisis. Yeah. Hello?
Yeah, ma'am, you were saying about pride in Kerala, especially among the lesbians. So, what are the major findings? Like, one of the major reasons which you found behind it, and do you think how we can overcome, especially when it's part of the society? How can we overcome such situation? I know it's impossible, sudden, but still.
The other like queer women and female-born communities since we started over a span of 20 years. So like I said, we did our first fact-finding in 2002, and we did our most recent one this year, you know. And it's, you know, it's such a big question, you know, and I think that because it's happens, I mean, obviously, like creating more social acceptance is I think a really key kind of thing, you know, more sort of mainstream acceptance in society. We've been doing, you know, lots of visualization. There's tons of groups now. There's tons of different spaces, identities, all those things, you know, is I think someone did a study where, you know, just to, you know, where they said that places in societies where gay marriage was legalized found that regardless of whether people got married or not, that the suicide rates went down, you know. So maybe different types of recognition. Kerala, you know, something that like you know, government has made some liberals, government is making some actions, like it changed the whole structure of the community. That was started being out, being articulate as activists, and I think that other types of state support, other types of social support, visibility, may help the suicide rate, and probably lots of other things, lots of awareness, awareness for doctors, awareness for, you know, the legal profession, families, support for families who have queer, trans children, many things. I think, yes. Are there any more questions? I feel like I'm kind of talking. I think, yeah, please drop questions. I'm so sorry that, I mean, I will understand most of your questions in Malayalam. It's just my Malayalam, and I speak Malayalam, but not very well. So I can speak more complicated. I mean, in English, so maybe too complicated. Okay, so
Deepa ma'am പറയുന്നത് എന്തെങ്കിലും ദീപ മാം പറയുന്നത് എന്തെങ്കിലും ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസ് ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഒന്നെങ്കിൽ മലയാളത്തിൽ ചാറ്റിൻ ഇൻബോക്സിൽ ഇടാം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ പറഞ്ഞാൽ മതി, ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് ദീപ മാഡത്തിന്റെ അടുത്ത് എത്തിക്കാം. എന്നിട്ട് മാഡം അതിന്റെ ആയിട്ടുള്ള ആൻസർ നമ്മളോട് പറയുന്നതായിരിക്കും. സോ എന്തെങ്കിലും ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസ് ഉണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഒന്നെങ്കിൽ ഡയറക്റ്റ് മൈക്ക് ഓൺ ചെയ്ത് സംസാരിക്കാം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നമ്മുടെ ഈ ചാറ്റിൽ നിങ്ങൾക്ക് നിക്ഷേപിക്കാവുന്നതാണ്. സോ എനിവൺ?
I'm going to just talk about two lesbian crisis interventions that I was involved in, like before. Actually, what I want to do is I want to flag some things that are continuous, like from, like, say 20 years ago till now, and you know, and because I think that even if I talk about those experiences, those things are, even with legalization, those things are happening, and then I want to talk a bit about the effects of legalization on queer, you know, community, lesbian community, and then I'll, yeah. And so okay, like you know, one of our first cases was involved, you know, both of these people are my friends now, and I hope they don't mind me sharing their stories, but say was a young woman who you know, came out of her house when she was 18. She had a girlfriend. They tried to run away together, and they were brought towards the court. They were 18, 19 years old in Kotam, and actually, you know, even before Sahiatrika started, there are newspaper stories of young women wanting to live together and coming towards the court, and the judges saying they're adults and they can live together. You know, we have records of stories like that, and we also have lots of stories of judges saying, no, you have to go back to your family, this is immoral. All of those things. It really just depended on the judge that people, you know, came towards. And in this case, the judges said they were up to over 18 and they were at liberty to live with whoever they wanted to. But the families came to the courthouse and they had these big sticks, and they said, okay, fine, we'll do as you say. The police let the girls each go with their individual families, and then the family separated them. And so one girl was under house arrest, and we were never really able to contact her, and the other girl was medicated for about 5 months, and eventually she came out and she became part of a community. But that is, so that's an example of a crisis, and it's kind of like the kind of biggest violence we face, and the biggest kind of the biggest violence and biggest crisis interventions that we do are within the family, and within the family people not being able to accept their daughter's sexual or relationship choices, so that's and over again that happens. That's still a type of crisis. Now we have more support, but our kind of biggest crisis always involves things like negotiating with families, going to courts, going to police stations, and trying to get people to have this kind of right to live according to their wishes. Do you want to translate?
ഇപ്പൊ പറഞ്ഞ ഭാഗം ആർക്കെങ്കിലും ട്രാൻസ്ലേഷൻ ആവശ്യമുണ്ടോ? എങ്കിൽ നമുക്ക് പോകാം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അടുത്ത ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസിലായിട്ട് പോകാൻ പറ്റും.
Okay, fine. So, okay, I'll give another example. Then that was one of our early kids. The other kid, this is actually, actually this is not it's not a lesbian case. It's a case of a female partner of a trans man. But I'm giving this as an example because I think the problem that we see over and over again is a problem of patriarchy in that, and it happens to lesbians, it happens to partners of trans men, it happens to trans men whose families can't accept their identities. But the thing is, if you are born into a family as a woman, that thing of women sort of being property or always having to be protected, that thing of like women always needing either a father or a husband to support them, that's, and then when people come out of that system and they try to say, no, I want to live with a woman, or I don't want to live as a woman, or, families feel a lot of proprietariness, like a lot of sort of entitlement around controlling their kids. So we see a lot of things like house arrest. We see a lot of things like psychiatric treatment. And then like it can happen at all sorts of levels in terms of now it is changing, but you still see it in terms of like judges imposing their kind of moral interpretation, police officers combining with families and basically trying to kind of control women and female-born people's right to choice around sexuality and gender. So the second case I wanted to talk about happened maybe around 2010, 11, and it involved the partner of a trans woman. But I'm bringing this up because again, it's this woman's identity, So like, and she had a trans man partner, and she came to Kerala, and her family also put her under house arrest, and she was in contact with us, and her relative was a police officer. We went to her house and got beat up with the police and stuff, and but we made a habeas corpus for this woman, and she was like in her late 20s, and every single space that woman went into, and this was after the Delhi High Court verdict, before our 2018 thing, when so we thought that, which was kind of this press, like suddenly same queer identities were supposedly decriminalized, at least according to the Delhi High Court. And this woman went to the police station and said very clearly, I want to go back and live independently. I don't want to say family. She went to the courts and she said very clearly, I want to live independently. We weren't talking about their relationship because we didn't have, it was much legally more unstable, but the judge kept denying her, you know, because he was having this kind of moral kind of doubt about, you know, the sort of morality of her relationship, and so he kept on trying to find ways to like put her into halfway houses and giving her more time to make up her mind, you know. And eventually we got a very good lawyer, and after like 2 months of legal cases, she was set at liberty to go back to her partner. I wanted to flag one more thing when we're talking about like female born issues, which is that besides like having lots of connections with queer experiences of queer people, trans people, you know, sometimes, you know, like other people also experience house arrest and domestic violence. You know, there's a very strong kind of correlation between what happens in for female-born people and women who are trying to have same-sex relationships or trying to live in a different gender, and what happens to women who have relationships outside of their caste or their class, you know, the caste or the religion. So, you know, Hadia is a famous case where, you know, like she converted to Islam, and the initial court that she went to basically dissolved her marriage, saying that she didn't have that choice or that agency. And so it's a very similar kind of thing that people don't think that girl children, whether they're lesbians or eventually trans or whatever, can have agency. Another example I can give you for that is this idea that like whenever like a lesbian or a queer woman or a trans man leaves their home, you know, and there's a crisis very often, like especially with women, especially with, you know, the actually women identities, there's always this issue, like the courts and the police, they'll often say, well, who's going to take custody of this woman? You know, even if she's over 18, if she's over 25, if she's not with her family and she's not with her husband, you know, who's going to take custody for her? And I don't think that happens as often to male-born people, even if they're queer or trans. You know, and some of you can talk about that. Maybe I'm wrong, but I have a strong feeling about that. And so, like, even with Anjana Harish's case, you know, Anjana Harish had left her family. She had gone to live with some other queer friends, and within the community, there was a sort of backlash against them, and they were saying that these friends should have been more responsible. They shouldn't have allowed this to happen. But I think this whole idea that women don't have agency to make decisions for themselves, and they're always someone else's responsibility, is something that like comes up in our crisis cases. I think I'll just take a break, and then I think I'm going to try to talk more contemporary stuff. But should I answer questions now, or should I just keep talking and then answer at the end? What do you think?
We can open for discussion, I think.
Okay, cool. Okay.
Ma'am, there is a question in chat box. Can I read it now?
Yes, of course. Yes.
Okay. So the question is, why is there such a disparity in the rate of suicides in rural and urban India, being rural India more? How could we do more in the rural part of our country?
Well, that's outside of my scope, because I'm talking about, you know, lesbian suicides and suicides of queer people, and I'm not sure we've quantified it in that way. Like, I don't know if it's higher in urban or rural. I just know that you know, it seems to be very high. You know, that you know, if I look at my friendship circle of queer and trans people, I know a lot of people. I've lost a lot of people to suicide, and I think that we haven't quantified that. You know, like when Kajit wanted me to give a report, and I just was thinking about all the things, like reading things and trying to think about what to talk about, and thinking of all the things that we haven't written enough about and that we need to try and do. So I can't give you a statistic around that.
Ma'am, there is also a message from Jinesh Jinu which says most of the queer persons have a stressful childhood. This leads to many mental problems like depression, mood swings, etc. So as a queer one, should we able to know themselves as normal, or educational system should include such topics in education? What's your view about this, ma'am?
Yeah, of course, I completely agree, and there's so many different levels in which that could happen in terms of talking about different types of families and not just only having a kind of heterosexual model, or having sex education, or having education for doctors that is more comprehensive, so that, in terms of, understanding, and all sorts of professionals. So yeah, I mean, of course, education is important. I think, besides this kind of childhood experience, there's this adult experience when one comes into the adult world, and then either is, kind of the sort of forced heterosexual, cisgender heterosexual marriage is a huge issue for people once they reach adulthood, and it's still very much an expected sort of thing. And so I think, like, for example, the suicides, a lot of times, the suicides of young people have been triggered by forced marriages, or people being in a relationship and one of them getting married and stuff. So, childhood, yes, and also what happens in adulthood and the types of choices that people are allowed to make.
Ma'am, there is also a message from Priyanka MP. She says that, ma'am, I started feelings when I was a kid. I realized it's 2 years ago. I don't know what I am, bisexual, but I am more into girls. Maybe I'm a lesbian. I feel like I'm like man. I like to wear men's dress.
Yeah, please contact us. We'd love to, we'd love for you to meet more people. I do read it. The thing is, I like 99%. So I think, I'm glad. Welcome to our community. There's many organizations. Our organization is there. You can meet new people. I wanted to say this thing about gender identity. Okay, so let's start. So, okay, in our scholars discussion, one person was talking about Sanchara, the film by Liddy. So I'll just use this as a starting point. And she was talking about the ending of the film, and the one character, Kiran, like the one girl gets married, and the other girl kind of asserts herself as a different person who's not going to, I think, be in that marriage system. That's it, by cutting her hair. And, there's lots of different interpretations of what that hair cutting means. Right now, we had a discussion in South Africa, and some people were saying, people think if you're lesbian, you have to cut your hair, and that's kind of a lesbian thing. Or what this scholar was saying is that maybe it was an assertion about her gender identity, and maybe she, I think the suggestion she was making is maybe she was a trans man, and that's gender is, we decide our gender. Our gender is what feels comfortable to us, and it might change over time. And so I think it's good to talk to lots of people. I wanted to say that, a lot of trans men, when they talk about their journey, they talk about how they thought they were a lesbian, or other people thought they were a lesbian, and then eventually they thought about it, or they were exposed, and they decided that they were trans. And I've, spent the last 20 years of my life in Kerala, supporting trans men as well as queer women, and I completely support that and agree with that. But I think that the opposite thing also happens. I think that, someone like, being a lesbian or being a queer woman doesn't necessarily mean that you're cisgender. I might see myself as genderqueer, but I have this cisgender privilege. I look like the way someone with my genitals is supposed to look like, according to society. And but even lesbians are not all cisgender. There's lots of lesbians, like my partner, like lots of people who, might be more masculine in their presentation, or they might see themselves as genderqueer. There's lots of different identities for people to choose from. And sometimes I feel, or I fear, and I don't want to say this to invalidate anyone's identity, but I wonder about what the effect is now that so many of these identities are legal, but there's a certain type of government support, and there's a certain type of visibility for trans, that how that affects people's kind of decisions about their identities. And maybe that's something that's constantly changing because, you know, in another situation, you know, many trans people have felt no, you know, pressure to have other identities. But it's kind of a thing which I want, you know, like I think that government policy has had a huge effect on queer and trans people in Kerala and who comes out and who becomes visible, you know, so it's really interesting. And for Priyanka, I you know, I support whatever identity you have, and I hope that you get in contact with, there's lots of folks around, you know, and you're very, you know, welcome in this community. And the other thing Priyanka has talked about is parents, and that's true. Our primary crisis intervention point is parents, you know, it's families, it's parents and communities where they're not willing to accept their children's choices. And sometimes we're able to talk to people and they come to understandings. Sometimes people themselves are able to negotiate with their parents, and sometimes parents become desperate and they do desperate things like resort to conversion therapy or resort to house arrest, forced marriage, you know, because it's such a strongly ingrained thing in so many, in the society and different communities and different religions. And, you know, I really feel, I mean, I have to say I really respect Queerythm in this regard, in that they've done, they pay a lot of attention to this concept of family, saying we're a family, you're a family, and that, you know, I believe that, you know, people have tried to do things like family support groups and things, because I think that actually one of the reasons that these abuses happen is that families also need support. They also need education, information. You know, if your kid is queer, trans, and all the people around you are ostracizing you, you also need a type of support. So there's a lot of types of discussions and awarenesses that need to happen. Should I continue?
Yes. ഇപ്പൊ പറഞ്ഞ ഭാഗം ആർക്കെങ്കിലും ട്രാൻസ്ലേഷൻ ആവശ്യമുണ്ടോ? ഇത് നമുക്കത് പറഞ്ഞിട്ട് അടുത്തതിലേക്ക് നീങ്ങാം.
So I wanted to talk about that because I, you know, just being old, and that's also why I hope that, you know, like I hope for the more recent crisis cases, other people from Sahayatrika can talk, because I don't get that much involved in crisis, except for I give advice and I hear about it and I write about it for funding reports and stuff. But
Deepa, can I ask something now?
Please.
Yes. ഞാൻ മലയാളത്തിൽ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലും കൂടെ പറയാം, അപ്പം മനസ്സിലാവും.
Okay, ശരി.
നമ്മൾ സഹയാത്രികയുടെ തുടക്ക സമയത്തുള്ള ഈ ക്രൈസിസുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട അല്ലെങ്കിൽ കേരളത്തിൽ നടന്ന സൂയിസൈഡുകൾ റിപ്പോർട്ട് ചെയ്യുന്ന ഒരു പാറ്റേൺ ഉണ്ടല്ലോ, ന്യൂസ് പേപ്പർ റിപ്പോർട്ടിംഗ് എന്ന് പറയുന്നത്. Maybe you had a look around that kind of reporting, you know.
Yes.
The way they reported and the sensitivity. പക്ഷെ what kind of changes, you know, ഈ ഒരു സമയത്ത് റീസെന്റ് ആയിട്ട് വരുന്ന റിപ്പോർട്ടുകൾ, ഈവൻ അഞ്ജനയുടെ സൂയിസൈഡുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട് വന്ന റിപ്പോർട്ടുകളൊക്കെ തന്നെ നമ്മൾ കമ്മ്യൂണിറ്റിയെ പലതരത്തിലും പിൻ പോയിന്റ് ചെയ്യുന്ന തരത്തിലായിരുന്നു. കമ്മ്യൂണിറ്റിയാണ് പ്രശ്നം എന്ന രീതിയിലൊക്കെ ആയിരുന്നു. So what kind of changes have you identified or എന്തെങ്കിലും അങ്ങനെ?
നല്ല ചോദ്യമാണ്. First of all, I think, you know, the changes have been huge. You know, if we're not, you know, in that, but, you know, even in 2002, 2003, you know, Nandu and Sheila came out. They did a visibility campaign around being lesbian. So it's not like, you know, these things, you know, haven't been happening before. You know, but like when we started, I could never have imagined, like, say, the sort of government support that's available for trans people, the sort of, you know, like decriminalization. We thought that would happen eventually, but just so many groups, you know, like you know, as an individual and as someone, like you know, with some supporters struggling so long alone, and I'm just like, so many people speaking Malayalam better than me, talking about their identities and their journeys. Like it's amazing. But I think that, you know, my experience over like kind of observing for 20 years is I think that when we engage with media, and from our respective identities, the media is better. And then when we stop engaging with media, then that creates a space for people to just be homophobic, transphobic, slut shaming, all of these things, and without many people to respond. So like I think there's been very good media, I think there's been very bad media. I think Rishma talked about, there was this magazine, Fire magazine, when we first started. It's still around. It was kind of like a yellow paper, and they would constantly make these lesbian stories and make these masala stories. So like one of the suicides of these two Adivasi girls that we've investigated, they took the same photo from multiple angles and plastered it and all of the thing. But the really horrible thing was that they were somehow finding real people, and they were finding people who very often were queer and stuff, and then they were creating these sort of masala stories and shaming them. Recently in Thrissur, there was a case of a woman whose lover, or her, people were saying her lover committed suicide, and they made a POSCO case against her. I think she was actually over 18. They were both young women. And so we just had a lot of newspaper stories basically talking about this criminal lesbian who had murdered her lover. And Sahiyatrika team did a fact-finding about it. They went and they talked to the family of the girl, and that family, when they went to the house, they said they were actually contemplating suicide, because this thing had been spread all over the papers. And we gave different type. We tried to show that we were there and give support, and they had a lawyer, and eventually that woman was released. But her family was traumatized, and I don't know if she's someone who would come out about her identity or whatever. She hasn't contacted us, but that's just to say that that media exploitation is still happening. In the case of Anjana Harish, I think that after Sahiyatrika released a statement, I think some of the sort of progressive shit throwing reduced, and I think that that's true for numbers of groups and individuals. Like when we engage with media and when we talk about our identities in terms of rights and in terms of social justice, human rights, basic decency, then people, that it has a kind of silencing effect. People feel more encouraged to write supportive pieces, and people feel less able to get away with really slanderous stuff. So that's my observation about it. It's kind of like this ongoing thing we have to keep on doing. We have to keep on sensitizing. We have to keep on articulating. And sometimes we get into spaces, like I can talk for my experience or my organization's experience. Sometimes you need a break from it too. It's like you can't just always, like as an individual, you can't just always be kind of a warrior and always out there and educating people. Sometimes you do it. Sometimes you step back and maybe let other people do it.
Thank you. മറ്റാർക്കെങ്കിലും റെസ്പോണ്ട് ചെയ്യാനുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ ഈ വിഷയത്തിൽ പ്രതികരണം നടത്താനോ നിങ്ങളുടെ നിരീക്ഷണങ്ങൾ പറയാനോ ഒക്കെ ഉണ്ടെങ്കിലും സംസാരിക്കാം. മലയാളത്തിൽ തന്നെ പറഞ്ഞാൽ മതി.
അതെ ഞാൻ മനസ്സിലാകുന്നുണ്ട്. എന്റെ മലയാളം ഭയങ്കര ക്രാഫിയാണ്, അത്രേ ഉള്ളൂ.
ദീപചേച്ചി, ഒരു ചോദ്യം ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. നമ്മൾ ഈ പാത്ത് ഫൈൻഡിങ്ങുമായിട്ട് പോകുന്ന സമയത്ത്, അതായത് തുടക്കകാലങ്ങളിൽ ഇപ്പൊ 2000 ആ സമയങ്ങളിൽ പോകുന്ന സമയത്ത് എത്തരത്തിലായിരുന്നു ആ നാട്ടുകാരുടെ പ്രതികരണം, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അവിടുത്തെ പോലീസ് അങ്ങനെയുള്ള ആളുകളുടെ പ്രതികരണം? അതുപോലെ നമ്മൾ എപ്പോഴെങ്കിലും ഈ ഒരു നമ്മളുടെ കയ്യിലുള്ള ഗവൺമെന്റിനോട് എന്തെങ്കിലും ഇടപെടൽ നടത്താനായിട്ട് നമുക്ക് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റിയിരുന്നു? ഗവൺമെന്റിന്റെ ഭാഗത്ത് എന്തെങ്കിലും രീതിയിലുള്ള പോസിറ്റീവായിട്ടുള്ള എന്തെങ്കിലും ഒരു ഇനിഷ്യേറ്റീവ് ഉണ്ടായിട്ടുണ്ടോ എന്ന് പറയാനൊരു താല്പര്യം.
So you're asking, like, say, in response to our suicides, our lesbian suicides, fact findings then or now, what sort of government initiative could happen to make the situation better? Is that what you're asking about?
First question is, how was the response from the local people and from the police and all when we reaching as part of the path finding?
it really varied, it really varied, and we had to be very sensitive about it. And some of them I wasn't there, Rachel was there, some of them I was also present, and Maya, and someone came from Labia once, Dr. Jayshree was there. So we were women, we were going into communities and saying we were just investigating suicide. And again, there wasn't this kind of public discourse about LGBT issues. And then, like, for example, in the case of Manju and Ragini, who were the two other Vasi girls, in which we did, I think, the most sort of extensive fact-finding around families were really different. So Manju's family, they were actually quite supportive of her, and so gradually we kind of ended up telling them who we were and what we wanted to do as we wanted to give support to stop lesbians or, these queer people from committing suicide. And they were saying that maybe if you had come here earlier, she would have lived. And then the other girl's family said that, it was better off that she was dead rather than being in this relationship. So obviously with those people, we didn't talk about we didn't, at that time, it wasn't a place to talk about our perspective. But I think that what we found, and I think I think I wish we should really do something with those things, those documents, or, I should do it, or we should do it. It's very interesting kind of documents about what people's attitudes were at the time. And, you found like kind of a range of attitudes. Some people were very, saying all these kind of slanderous and phobic things you would expect. And other people kind of had these kind of spaces of acceptance even then. But, another thing that often happened was that even when families were ready to accept the children, they had all this other pressure from their communities, from their neighbors, from their relatives. And so it was very difficult for families to support their children, even if they loved them and they might have supported them without the pressure. So maybe we need to, we have to have this kind of counter pressure. You asked a question about the government also.
Yeah. Is there any positive effort from the side of government, any political parties or?
Yeah, if you're taking the long view, like you're looking at 20 years, then yeah, Kerala transgender policy and the fact we have transgender cell, it's a huge thing. I can't even.
I'm not asking about
lesbians. Lesbians, yes.
Yeah,
yes,
about
yes.
lesbian suicides.
Lesbian suicides. I think it's an area of work we need to do, and we haven't had many people from government reach out to us. I think the first time we had a queer pride, Rishma talked about it, that there was, some of the Women's Commission came and wanted us to do a survey. And I think we've had, since we've been around for so long, we have like feminist friends who've been in the Women's Commission and things. But I think we have not been approached by government, and I think it's something that we actually need to do, like the initiative needs to come out, not just South Africa, maybe people here, maybe but like I think that we should do something like a Kerala transgender survey. LGBT generally, but also one specifically around female-born sexualities and gender identities, because we don't have adequate data, and our experience is just so all over the place, like in terms of different classes, different caste communities. Like we really, I think that like personally, I feel like that we need to systemize it. We need to look at it. We need to create some data, and because if we have the data, then we can advocate for government. And it's like, usually that advocacy needs to come from, the communities, not just lesbian community, queer communities and all of that. People aren't going to, so I think that we need to do that. And I think that lesbians are in a kind of, first of all, any lesbian has at least, this double marginalization about being a woman and being a sexual minority, and sometimes people have many other identities by which they're marginalized, and sometimes it's like we don't fit in anywhere, you know, because there's a lot of sort of mainstream women's services that are cut off for us, you know, and at the same time we can't avail of, you know, things that are in the transgender policy, even though we also are marginalized in different ways. And I think one thing is things like this, creating, you know, like having more dialogues around this in this kind of like, you know, lesbian, queer woman supportive space. And I also think that we need to renew our engagement with the women's movement. And that's kind of, it's difficult because I think the women's movement itself, feminist movements right now in Kerala, you don't, you know, they're very individualized. You don't have sort of organizations, that many visible organizations the way we did when we started, you know. But there's a lot of issues. Lesbians have a lot of commonalities with divorcees, single women, women with multiple partners, like any woman who has to leave the family system and loses support, as well as all the commonalities we have with, you know, gay and trans communities. And I think we need to kind of try and get all of those things, you know, try and review our. And you know, the thing is, we're still constantly in crisis. You know, like we're still in people's lives. Even in, you know, yeah, I think I'm, you know, probably the most privileged person in South Africa. And I still have my fair share of crisis, and you know, but there's a lot of kind of systemic things that come from being a woman who is not in relation with family or in marriage, you know. And even if you're not actually single, you actually have a partner or something, you know, like, you know, then let's go from one extreme to the other. Me and my partner are kind of, you know, class privileged, you know, people, and, you know, we have lots of privileges that, like, when we live, it's still hard for us to find housing. This is my own flat that I live in Kerala. My building society is very conservative. I've had lots of problems with them. So we just kind of, we don't, you know, even though I'm been an activist for 20 years and my partner is kind of an out lesbian musician, we don't go around telling people our identities. We just let them. Lots of people suspect. Some people just assume we're relatives, and we just, you know. And then when we lived in Bombay, we couldn't, you know, we could not find a flat in the place that we wanted to, like, just to kind of, you know, it was, you know, like in the suburbs. You know, we could not get the flat because there was no male in our relationship. You know, when we didn't tell people we were lesbians. We were even married. We've gotten married in South Africa, and you know, we couldn't get a flat, so we had to say that I'm an aunt and she's, you know, I'm Mossy and she's my niece and stuff. So even within a privileged space, you could feel. Then, you know, having so many marginalizations, you know, you get opted out of so many different types of systems. There's so many types of government things where you should have a husband or you should have a family, you know. So like I have some friends who are like a working class lesbian couple, and they've been together for 20 years, and they have a what's it called? They have a ration card, you know, but the thing is they had to tell the people, their sisters, to get it. You know, I can't put my partner as a beneficiary in any of my bank accounts in India because she's, you know, either you have to be married, have a heterosexual marriage, or be a family. So there's lots of ways in which women generally who are not in the system, family system, get excluded, and then, you know, as a lesbian or a queer woman, all those things are sort of compounded. So that's kind of a long, winding answer, but yeah, like, I mean, there's a lot more that needs to be done. I don't think government has been very proactive in terms of like reaching out to us, and we probably have to reach out, but we do have lots of individual supporters who've done amazing things for us, you know, in queer movement and women's movement and other social movements, and so that's a good thing.
That's great. മറ്റെന്തെങ്കിലും ചോദ്യങ്ങളുണ്ടോ? ഇന്ന് ഒരുപാട് പേര് നെറ്റ്വർക്ക് ഇഷ്യൂസ് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. പേഴ്സണൽ മെസ്സേജ് വന്നു. ഇവിടെ മഴയും അങ്ങനെയൊക്കെയാണ് പലയിടങ്ങളിലും. മേ ബി അതായിരിക്കും. നെറ്റ്വർക്ക് ഇഷ്യൂസ് ഒരുപാട് പേര് പറഞ്ഞിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു.
ശരി ശരി. ഞാൻ മലയാളത്തിൽ സംസാരിച്ചാൽ, does it help or is it very difficult to understand? I can talk in Malayalam. It's not very good.
both works. No issues.
Okay. So like I mean, so you know, in the very observation on it, like illegal changes vanita queer and trans community would have lot of changes vanita. And again, I don't need to talk about it because people, you know, like this, you know, what happened in terms of trans communities after there was a transgender policy, and you know, government support is just, you know, it's not something I ever imagined, because in Kerala we didn't have these traditional trans identities, and now you have quite a bit of trans visibility and quite a bit of are very articulate activists, trans women, also trans men. Trans men, again, with this sort of patriarchal thing, you know, find less visibility, and like generally, female-born identities are less visible within the whole LGBT framework. But there's still more, you know, like that. It created a whole community of people that was not there, that was not able to organize around their rights before. So that's, you know, it might be problematic. That's incredible. Then when, you know, the 2018 Supreme Court judgment came out, we had this kind of slew of people coming out to their families because they think it's legal, and it is legal, but the social culture hasn't changed that much. So I think after 2000, like if we look at our crisis interventions in South Africa, after NALSA policy, and then more directly after the creation of you know, transgender things within the social justice department, suddenly we had all these trans men in our communities, and so like we went from you know, like I think after NALSA and after Kerala Transformed, like right now, probably, you know, more than 50% of our members identify as trans or gender non-conforming, and that was not the case before, you know, before these legal things. Then after 2018, after the Supreme Court, then we started getting lots of lesbian crises again, and you know, and a lot of times the story is that these women, they think that it's legal, and so they come out to their families, or they decide to live together and all these things, but the social support is still not there, you know. And so, you know, and I think that our team, I don't know, you know, Praveen, lesbian crisis interventions കുറിച്ച് എന്തെങ്കിലും സംസാരിക്കാൻ, you know, ഉണ്ട്. ഇത് വളരെ നല്ലതായിരിക്കും.
ഇതേ സെയിം വിഷയം തന്നെ ട്രാൻസ്ജെൻഡർ ആൾക്കാരും നേരിടുന്ന ഒരു പ്രശ്നമാണ്. ഐ മീൻ, ഇത് പറയുന്നതാണ്. There is a policy which supports transgender people. Even we have a law. Transgender Act is there. പക്ഷേ ഫാമിലിയിൽ നിന്നും സൊസൈറ്റിയിൽ നിന്നുള്ള സപ്പോർട്ടാണ് ഇപ്പോഴും, you know, something lacks there. So
definitely, yes, yeah, that's definitely true, and I'm not trying to, yeah, you know, that, you know, and I think that as a sort of cisgender sexual minority, you know, like, you know, definitely I have some privileges that, you know, trans people don't have, like with government policy. But at the same, you know, a lot of different things happen, right? So I mean, I'm just trying to say, like, I'm not, you know, like, yeah, so that so what's happened with us in terms of like lesbian crisis is that after, and not just us, most of the sort of LGBT organizations in India after 2018, they had to just deal with this onslaught of crisis cases, you know, from trans people and from lesbians, and I think the difference, like say if I look at our organization, and you know, besides say cisgender privilege, you know that, but, and you know, again, not all lesbians are cisgender. Some people are gender non-conforming, gender queer. I'm gender queer in my mind, but I have this cisgender privilege. But what was my point? That you know, the thing is, we don't have this visibility and state sanctioned support, right? So I mean, you know, NALSA and even this horrible, you know, trans bill, which, you know, is deeply problematic, but it, you know, in lots of ways, and, you know, is slightly better now than when it came out. But I mean, there's lots of directives to government about kind of social welfare. You know, some of these might be incredibly problematic. There might be many obstacles for people obtaining those things, but the fact that they are there gives you something to advocate for, you know. So the thing with the decriminalization of any same-sex, you know, sexuality identities is that it's not come with other types of reforms, and maybe like more privileged community members don't need it in the same way, like, maybe, but, then there's still issues across classes and castes, like, wanting to have children, maybe wanting your relationship recognized, having, things that I talked about. But then, at the same time, then people who are more marginalized, need other types of state support too. And sometimes you might have other marginalized identities. You might be a woman, you might be Dalit, and you're still not eligible for those things, because of different things that happen because of your identity. And so I think, we need some other types of support and not just decriminalization. We need some other types of recognition, in the society.
I think, there is a point like, Dilip, yeah, please.
ഞാൻ ചോദിക്കാതെ ട്രാൻസ്ലേറ്റ് ചെയ്ത് കൊടുക്കാവോ? എന്റെ സംശയം
ഷുവർ മലയാളത്തിൽ പറഞ്ഞോളൂ, ദീപയ്ക്ക് മനസ്സിലാവും.
Mostly 75%.
ഈ പറഞ്ഞ സിറ്റുവേഷൻസ് ഒക്കെ മാഡം ഒബ്സർവ് ചെയ്തതിൽ കൂടുതൽ കേരളത്തിലാണ്. കൂടുതൽ ആദിവാസികൾ എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് കേരളത്തിലാണ്. എങ്കിലും മാഡം ബോംബെയിലൊക്കെ താമസിച്ചപ്പോൾ ഫ്ലാറ്റ് കിട്ടാൻ ബുദ്ധിമുട്ടി, അങ്ങനെയുള്ള പ്രശ്നങ്ങളൊക്കെ പറഞ്ഞു. അപ്പൊ മൊത്തത്തിൽ ഒബ്സർവ് ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ കേരളത്തിലാണോ ഇത്ര ഇഷ്യൂസ് ഏറ്റവും കൂടുതൽ കാണുന്നത്? പുറത്തെ സ്റ്റേറ്റ് ഒക്കെ ഇതിൽ മോശമാണോ? എന്താ?
I just brought myself in, which I and that's why I would really like other people from our team. We have many people from marginalized backgrounds. I mean, it's not true that it's only in Kerala that there are Adivasis. There are Adivasis all over India, and there's marginalized communities all over India. But definitely, like actually our, so our kind of crisis base, we very roughly, unscientifically estimate, say, like 50% of our community people are from us backgrounds, 40% of our community members are Dalit, and having other different marginalized communities. And, I think many things are there, more things that I can talk about in this session, and more things that, people could talk better from their own experiences. But I would say that livelihood is a huge issue. And I think that when people leave the family system, then they have to survive. And being a marginalized community and then being cast out of your community is a hugely difficult thing. And once like people leave this, how do people survive? Where do you live? Where do you work? Where do you, if you can study, where do you study? Some people in Sahayatrika, like people who are coming from more marginalized backgrounds, they say that they think being queer or trans is the worst thing because and you can't really. I'm not saying that, like people can be disabled. There's lots of different isms, but because one of the worst things, because if you come from a marginalized community, your whole community is marginalized. So you can still sort of be together, but if you're like a queer or trans person, like a lot of the time you end up and you try to live according to your preferred gender or sexuality, then you also lose your community, and I think that, I mean, we were always focusing on crisis intervention, and like our sort of community, a lot of times it ended up being very marginalized queer and trans people because they didn't, those communities didn't have other supports of support, so I think one of the really exciting things about how so many people are coming forward now, and there's so many activists and so many people talking about their experiences, is there are people talking about their different locations, Adivasi. Yes, go on.
Does government or any other authorities consult you regarding any fact findings?
Not around lesbian issues. Again, like with the trans thing, we have some relationship with the transgender cell.
I think you already answered, when
and I'm blabbing. I'm sorry, but
Dilip, I can, give a feedback, like, നമ്മുടെ ആക്ടിവിസം എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഇന്ത്യയിലെ LGBT ആക്ടിവിസം എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു അർബനൈസ്ഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അർബൻ ബേസ്ഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ആക്ടിവിസം ആണ്. അപ്പം അത് കേരളത്തിലും അങ്ങനെ തന്നെയാണ്. പ്രത്യേകിച്ച് ഇപ്പൊ അത് മുംബൈ ആയാലും കൊച്ചി ആയാലും ട്രിവാൻഡ്രം ആയാലും ഡൽഹി ആയാലും ഒക്കെ തന്നെ അർബനൈസ്ഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഏരിയകളിലാണ് ആക്ടിവിസം നടക്കുന്നത്. അപ്പൊ അതുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ റൂറൽ ഏരിയ ഇന്ത്യയിലെ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ നമ്മുടെ തന്നെ റൂറൽ ഏരിയകളിലെ കമ്മ്യൂണിറ്റി മെമ്പേഴ്സിന്റെ അവസ്ഥകളെ കുറിച്ച് കൃത്യമായ പഠനമോ ഇടപെടലുകളോ ഒന്നും നടന്നിട്ടില്ല. lack that kind of intervention in rural India. So അത് എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു ഇനി നമുക്ക് CBOസിന് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഓർഗനൈസേഷൻസ് എല്ലാം തന്നെ നടത്തേണ്ടിയിരിക്കുന്നു. We have to move together and we have to intervene in these kind of areas, maybe in rural India and rural areas, so that we can find more individuals and give more assistance mentally, physically, and we can find their issues and all. അപ്പൊ അതൊരു ഹൈപ്പോത്തറ്റിക്കൽ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ കൂടിയാണ്. സിറ്റിയിൽ കൂടുതലാണോ ഗ്രാമത്തിൽ കൂടുതലാണോ എന്നല്ല, പക്ഷെ നമ്മൾ വർക്ക് ചെയ്യുന്നത് കൂടുതലും ഈ പറയുന്ന നഗരപ്രദേശങ്ങളിൽ ആയതുകൊണ്ടുള്ള ഒരു പ്രശ്നമാണ്. Am I right, Deepa?
Yeah, I completely agree with you. And I think, like, say besides CBOs, which are more like like trans oriented, and like also like women's groups that are women's groups, and also government, right? I mean, so I think like CDS had a project about integrating the panchayat system, and I'm not sure what the status of it is, but that's really kind of a brilliant initiative. Or when we did our fact finding in the Adivasi community for one of our first lesbians, the family that was actually supportive, they invited us to come and speak to their Kudumbashri, and I think like if we could, it's a huge amount of work, but I think that in terms of the long term, that would be a very good thing to be doing, is to be engaging with local groups and like non-urban groups, and also just in terms of our issues being understood, and in terms of us being able to link our issues with other issues. It's a very good way to go.
Even I can have something to say, like കേരളത്തിലെ ഗ്രാമപ്രദേശങ്ങളിലുള്ള നമ്മുടെ ലോക്കൽ അഡ്മിനിസ്ട്രേറ്റീവ് ബോഡികളുണ്ട്, പഞ്ചായത്ത് അങ്ങനെയുള്ള ബോഡികളിലേക്ക് കേരള ഇൻസ്റ്റിറ്റ്യൂട്ട് ഓഫ് ലോക്കൽ അഡ്മിനിസ്ട്രേഷൻ വഴി കുറേയധികം ഇന്റർവെൻഷൻസ് നടന്നിട്ടുണ്ട്. നമ്മളിപ്പോ ന്യൂലി ഇലക്റ്റഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള വിമൻ റെപ്രസെന്റേറ്റീവ്സിന്, ലൈക്ക് പഞ്ചായത്ത് പ്രസിഡന്റ്, മുനിസിപ്പാലിറ്റീസ് ആൻഡ് മേയേഴ്സ് കോർപ്പറേഷൻസ്, ബോഡി സെൻസിറ്റൈസ് ചെയ്തിട്ടുണ്ട്. അതിനൊരുപാട് ഹെൽപ്പ് ചെയ്യുന്നത്. ഐ തിങ്ക് നാളെ ഈ ഒരു എഫേർട്ട് എടുത്താൽ മാത്രമേ റൂറൽ ഏരിയയിലേക്ക് കൃത്യമായ സെൻസിറ്റൈസേഷൻ കൊണ്ടെത്തിക്കാൻ പറ്റും. ഫാമിലികൾ അക്സെപ്റ്റ് പറയുന്നതാണ് വലിയ കാര്യം. അതിന് ഒരുപാട് എഫേർട്സ് ഇനിയും എടുക്കേണ്ടി വരും. കാരണം അവർക്ക് ഇത്തരം ഇൻഫർമേഷൻ ഇല്ല, ഇത്തരം ആളുകളെ കുറിച്ച് അറിവില്ല, നോളജ് വളരെ കുറവാണ്. ഈ എഫേർട്ട് നമ്മൾ ഇനിയും എടുത്തുകൊണ്ടിരിക്കേണ്ടി വരും എന്ന് തന്നെയാണ് ഞാൻ മനസ്സിലാക്കുന്നത്.
I completely agree with you. Another area is political parties, right? I mean, because they have that reach, and those are the people who come into government, and there's not like I'm not familiar with the BJP personally, but I mean maybe people would, but I think that the other parties, they have at different times mentioned us in their platforms and things, like both LDF and UDF, and I think we need to also try to lobby on that level also. And it's a difficult thing, and I think some of us have always been part of kind of civil society and not involved, and that shouldn't be the only thing. But again, if you're talking about like kind of social reach, it's an important thing.
Deepa ma'am, hello.
Yes.
I have a question. I know that the pandemic situation is getting worse day by day. So many people, especially queer people, are forced to go back to their home. Especially queer women are forced to go back to their homes, and they are facing a lot of discrimination from homes and the society. But as a result, we came to know that many of the people are having high depression rate. They are living in a very bad condition. So they are forced to have suicidal threats or suicidal mentality. So what's your message to those people who are dealing with such situations?
Well, I don't know if I have a message. What should we do about it as organizations and individuals? and the other thing when we're talking about rural situations or, like not everyone can access Zoom, and like not everyone has good connectivity or familiarity. Something we found in lockdown is many people expanded their skills, their sort of virtual skills using their smartphones and stuff, but it's still not something people are really comfortable about. We have our telephone helpline, and I hope that, and other organizations also have ways that people can reach out to them, get support. Like, Anjana Harish is, probably the most well-known kind of suicide during lockdown, but I think there's probably been, others, and people are getting depressed. I think that in Kerala, it's, when it's still relatively better than other states in terms of the toy. Like, what I find is that people who are COVID positive, who, I'm not hearing many stories of, say, systemic discrimination of community people who have COVID. Like, everyone, maybe other people have different experiences, but I think that the health delivery, like, relatively speaking, has been quite good. But this kind of social impact is really hard. A lot of times what we've ended up doing when people want to, like, leave home with their partners and they can't, they want to go back, and so we end up just trying to sustain people during those times. And then sometimes we've had to make interventions by telephone. The person has to go to the local police station, but we can't be there. Sometimes we've tried to find friends, if depending on the state of lockdown, to give support. So, like, the sort of ways in which we support crisis is different. And also sometimes we're getting grants and donations, and so we're trying to distribute money to community people for things like groceries or rent. So, yeah, it's such a hard. Sorry.
Yeah. You can, Deepa.
It's such a. I've known so many people, community people who've committed suicide. I had two people who are, like, physically very close to me, and then committed suicide, like, not right in the same room as me, but in the next flat, or like having, and it's, I don't have an easy answer for it. Except that we should talk. We should talk about it. We should be compassionate with each other. And we should be compassionate with each other after suicides happen, and not kind of get into this whole thing of blaming people, which could happen, and be responsible. And it's sometimes people are depressed, they're isolated, and sometimes suicide is something someone plans for a long time, and then sometimes it's something that happens in a moment, and so you could be giving people support and not be able to control that, because it's someone's, on some level it's someone's own choice or someone's own understanding of their situation. I think that, just us being compassionate with each other, talking to each other more, and I think working for greater social acceptance. So, like, again, my new kind of stat that I found recently was the stat that, when there's same-sex marriage is legalized, the suicide rate goes down. So that's just one example. I mean, marriage is not the only issue, but, having different types of social recognition can help too. So, like, personally, just being there for people as much as we can, being there for ourselves. Self-care is really important, and I think as queer people and supporters, we need to make ourselves available for other people, and we also need to sometimes take time and step back. You can't be a superhuman and always be there for everyone. It's our collective, it's our collective responsibility, or a collective kind of situation. Like, let's share that. Let's try to be with each other. Let's try to create new connections.
സോ വേറെ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻസ് ഒന്നും ഇല്ലെങ്കിൽ നമുക്ക് വൈൻഡ് അപ്പ് ചെയ്യാനെ പറ്റി നോക്കാം. ഒരുപാട് പേര് പൂവൻ നെറ്റ്വർക്ക് കാര്യം പറഞ്ഞ് നമുക്ക് മെസ്സേജ് അയച്ചിട്ടുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. വെരി സോറി, പലയിടത്തും മഴയും അങ്ങനെ കുറെ ഇഷ്യൂസ് ആണ്, അതാണ് പ്രശ്നം പറ്റിയത്.
I wanted to say for any community people or researchers, please you can get my details from Queerythm, and also I can, besides answering questions myself, I can also direct you to our organization, and Queerythm is there. There's lots of, amazing different initiatives, but, if anyone wants to continue, and എനിക്ക് വളരെ സോറിയാണ് എൻ്റെ മലയാളം ഇത്ര വർഷമായി ഇത്ര മോശമാണ്. എനിക്ക് സംസാരിക്കാൻ പറ്റും, പക്ഷേ often people, it's easier for me to talk in English. So I know that when people, I'm so happy that there's so many activists now, and there's so many thoughtful people to express these things in Malayalam, because I know it has a completely different impact.
Okay, thank you, ദീപ. നമ്മള് ലെസ്ബിയൻ വിസിബിലിറ്റി വീക്കിന്റെ 6ാം ദിവസമായി ഇന്നാണ് നമ്മള് ലെസ്ബിയൻ ക്രൈസിസുമായി ബന്ധപ്പെട്ട കേരളത്തിലെ ചരിത്രവും ക്രൈസിസ് ഇന്റർവെൻഷനും ഒക്കെയാണ് നമ്മൾ സംസാരിച്ചത്. നമ്മുടെ ഒരു പ്രതികൂല സമയത്തും അല്ലെങ്കിൽ കാലാവസ്ഥയിലും ഒരുപാട് ആളുകൾ അവസരങ്ങളുണ്ടായിരുന്നു. വളരെ സന്തോഷം. ഒരു ഒഫീഷ്യൽ വോട്ട് ഓഫ് താങ്ക്സ് എക്സ്പ്രസ് ചെയ്യുന്നതിന് I would like to invite Arjun Geeta.
ഹായ്, ഹലോ, കൊടുകുളല്ലേ?
എനിക്ക് ഓർമ്മയുണ്ട്. I remember I met at another webinar.
Yes, താങ്ക് യു. ഓക്കെ, ഒഫീഷ്യലി പറയാം. എന്നാ നമ്മുടെ 6ാം ദിവസം വിസിബിലിറ്റി വീക്കിന്റെ 6ാം ദിവസം നമ്മുടെ പ്രോഗ്രാമില് നമുക്ക് ഒത്തിരി പേര് തന്നെ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നു. തുടക്കത്തിൽ പല കാരണങ്ങൾ കൊണ്ട് കുറച്ച് പേർക്ക് പോകേണ്ടി വന്നു. എങ്കിൽ ഈ അവസാന നിമിഷം വരെ നമ്മുടെ കൂടെ നിന്ന് ഈ പ്രോഗ്രാം വിജയിപ്പിച്ച എല്ലാവർക്കും, പിന്നെ ഇന്ന് സ്പീക്കറായിട്ട് ലെസ്ബിയൻ ക്രൈസിസ്, സൂയിസൈഡ് എന്നിവയ്ക്ക് ഉപരി ജീവിതങ്ങളെ കുറിച്ച് വളരെയധികം കാര്യങ്ങൾ സംസാരിച്ച എന്റെയും ക്യൂറിതത്തിന്റെയും അമിഗോസ് ഫാമിലിയുടെയും പേര് ഞാൻ ഒരു ഒഫീഷ്യലായിട്ട് നന്ദി പറയുകയാണ്. പിന്നെ എല്ലാവരും പങ്കെടുത്ത എല്ലാവർക്കും ക്യൂറിതത്തിന്റെയും അമിഗോസിന്റെയും പേര് ഞാൻ നന്ദി പറയും.
Thank you so much. It's really a wonderful program, and I'm really appreciative.
Thank you, Deepa. നാളെ നമ്മുടെ thank you. See you and stay safe.
Thank you. Bye, and I hope you have a great performance tomorrow. So,
yes. നമ്മുടെ അവസാന ദിവസമായ നാളെ ബാംഗ്ലൂർ ബേസ്ഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ആക്ടേഴ്സ് കളക്റ്റീവ് അവതരിപ്പിക്കുന്ന ലവ് മേക്സ് എ ഫാമിലി എന്ന ഫ്ലാറ്റ് തിയേറ്റർ ആണ്, പെർഫോമൻസ് ആണ്. അതിനൊരു സ്പെഷ്യൽ രജിസ്ട്രേഷൻ ഉണ്ട്. ഓൾറെഡി നമ്മൾ ഗ്രൂപ്പുകളിൽ അത് ഷെയർ ചെയ്യുന്നുണ്ട്. വളരെ ലിമിറ്റഡ് സീറ്റാണ്, 80 സീറ്റ് മാത്രമാണ് നമുക്ക് പ്രൊവൈഡ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റുന്നത്. ആ ഒരു പെർഫോമൻസിന്റെ സ്വഭാവം അനുസരിച്ചാണ് നമ്മൾ ആ സീറ്റ് പരിമിതമാക്കിയിരിക്കുന്നത്. അപ്പോൾ എല്ലാവരെയും നാളെ വൈകുന്നേരം 7 മണിക്ക് കാണാം. താങ്ക് യു. സ്റ്റേ സേഫ്.